Welcome back to Policy 340. Today we're going to talk about the harm principle, just put forward by John Stuart Mill in a really important book called On Liberty. We read the first little bit. Let me first, before I get to that, just reorient you with respect to where we are in the class. So this is a good outline of the normative frameworks that we're going to be talking about. And we've covered most of what you see on the screen here. So just before we left for spring break, we finished up with libertarianism, which you can see on the right. Today, we're going to talk about the harm principle. On Wednesday, we'll talk about libertarian paternalism or nudging. We're then going to spend Friday talking about some of the implications of these ways of thinking about public policy for regulation of soda or sugar-sweetened beverages. Next week, we're going to talk about conservatism. Week after that, we're going to use a lot of these principles and concepts to talk about issues in international affairs, immigration, aid to low-income countries, and just war theory. After that, we're going to jump into thinking about the ethics of research, focusing in particular on the ethics of public policy research. So I'm going to split the lecture up into two parts today so that you'll find a second file, which is going to talk about implications for public policy. So for now, we're just going to talk about the harm principle. So the question Mill starts out with in On Liberty has to do with the nature and limits of the power that society can legitimately exercise over the individual. So putting it a different way, thinking about what the scope of individual liberty should be. So the context here, Mill's writing in the 19th century, he's thinking that government is democratizing in the UK at the time, in England, and the monarch has much less power over the individual. And there's a lot of talk at the time that this is a great development, that finally the people in general will exercise control over the government as opposed to a few powerful individuals. And Mill's worry is really about what we now call, what he calls tyranny of the majority. The idea that even in a democracy, the majority of the people can infringe on the liberty of the minority, people who might have unpopular views, unpopular ways of living, unpopular religious beliefs. So that's sort of his concern. There's a couple of different forms of power that Mill mentions. We're going to focus on one, particularly because this is a public policy class. So one way society can control us is through law and government regulations, public policies. The other way, which in some ways is a lot more insidious and maybe even more powerful in a lot of ways, is socially enforced conventions or public opinion. So you could think of this, if you live in a small town, you could think of just how you might feel constrained in doing things that are a little bit different because you're worried about how your neighbors will think about you, how they might talk about you. There could be, in certain communities, very, very strong informal norms that are not a matter of law or policy, but that are nonetheless very constraining on people's behavior. It takes a lot of courage to go against those. Another contemporary way in which society exercises this type of informal control over people is through things like Twitter mobs and so-called cancel culture. So if someone says or does something in a public forum that's unpopular, that people perceive as being unfair, then oftentimes you'll see a group of individuals mount a campaign to really, in some sense, take steps to make that person lose their job or face other very, very severe consequences. So as I mentioned, because we're a public policy class, we're going to focus on one. So we're interested in what are the limits to law and public policy. Another way to think about it is, how do we draw this distinction between a sphere of action that we want to say is public and is the appropriate concern of government, right, and private action? So a sphere of action that is appropriately the concern of individuals, so that the government should have no control over whatsoever. Mill's solution to this is really simple. So it's called the harm principle. And he has a nice quote where he outlines it, which I've reproduced here. So he says, the only end for which people are entitled, individually or collectively, to interfere with the liberty of action of any of their number is self-protection. The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. Over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign. So a couple of things here just to note. First is the idea that the harm principle says the only time government can interfere with the liberty of another person is when they pose a harm to other people. So the idea is that, as Mill puts it at the end of this paragraph, when it comes to you and what we might call self-regarding as opposed to other-regarding actions, so actions that in some sense pose no threat of harm to others, that only concern yourself, you're sovereign. You get to make those decisions. You should not be subject to social control or coercive law or policy. The other thing to note, and I'll mention this again in the second part of today's lecture, is that he has this qualifier that of being against someone's will. So the thought is that people can engage in actions that harm other people, provided that you have consent. So consent, he's recognizing, is playing an important role here. So what's the argument? So Mill's a utilitarian. You remember that from the first part of class. And so he provides a utilitarian argument in favor of the harm principle. The one thing I would note is that you'll find a lot of people, scholars, commentators, etc., who really find the harm principle to be a very plausible way to think about what the appropriate role of government is, or what the legitimate role of government is, who don't classify themselves as utilitarians. So a lot of people just find it intuitive. They find individual liberty to be important. And so just starting from that premise, they'll say, look, individual liberty is important. And so that places constraints on how government can act. It can only act to prevent, in some sense, you might say, non-consensual harm to others, when someone is imposing harm to other people without their consent. Here's Mill's argument, it's the utilitarian argument. So it starts with the principle of utility, and then the key premise is premise 2. And Mill spends some time talking about this on liberty. So he says, the free development of individuality contributes greatly to human happiness. And so his thinking here is that each of us is different. We have different dispositions. We get pleasure and happiness and well-being from different types of activities, different ways of living. And so the way to have a happy society, the way that individuals are going to be happy, is if they get to engage in what he calls experiments in living. They get to be free to figure things out for themselves, right? To try different activities, try different, and experiment with different ways of living their lives. And that's the way that they're going to find out what gives them the most pleasure, and they can live accordingly. So it follows from 1 and 2 that people should be free to act as they wish, provided that they do not harm others. And so the harming of others here, you could just think of, when I harm you without your consent, I am going to be diminishing your happiness. And so it follows from 3, the government may only interfere with people's liberty of action in order to prevent them from harming others. This is basically the harm principle. So some questions for discussion. So things just to think about. I'll be hosting some sessions next week, Wednesday, maybe Thursday, when we can talk about these in office hours. There's some things to think about. First is, does this seem reasonable? Does it seem like a reasonable way to limit the scope of public policy? So can you think of any cases where you might think government should step in when someone is only posing a risk of harm to themselves? Second to think about, is premise 2 correct? So is Mill right that people will indeed be happier if they're free to act as they see fit? So a counterexample to this would be, do you think people might be happier on average if they're instead subject to a variety of policies that restrict their behavior, that aim to guide their behavior, even when those behaviors are not posing any threat of harm to others? And finally, what's missing? So Mill gives us the harm principle. It sounds very plausible. What does he need to define? What term has he not defined? Right. So just to give you the answer to this question, he doesn't give us a definition of what harm is. And so you can see how if you authorize the government to intervene when people pose a threat of harm to others, what do we count as harm? Right. That's going to be a crucial question. So on the one hand, we definitely want to count things like physical assault, right? That's sort of a classic example. If you think about violence as a classic example of harm to others. But then other thing to think about is, what about forms of speech, right? Should we think of hate speech as harmful to those that it targets, right? What about forms of emotional abuse, right? So we need to put boundaries on this term to think through what the government ought to be doing.